New York School. The New York School of Writing emerged during the 1950s and 60s, and the name was coined by the painter John Myers, who was in charge of a gallery of a museum in New York, and he also edited a work called The Poets of the New York School in 1969. Okay, so he brought together a number of poets and then termed them the New York School. Okay, so the New York School of Art, the New York School of Art basically pertained to architecture, painting basically, and there was a highly experimental stream in painting, style in painting. So when this is adopted into poetry, it came to be known as New York School of Art. Okay, it also encouraged expressionism, abstract expressionism, where everything is depicted in very abstract way, and whatever the subjective mind is depicted on canvas. Okay, and like the New York School of Painting, the poets were also highly experimental. They borrowed elements from the visual arts. Visual arts basically painting and architecture, which is obvious because the New York School was basically a school in painting. And they also adopted elements from French Surrealism and French Symbolism. Okay, so there were two generations of poets in the New York School. The New York School was fundamentally a highly experimental kind of a group of highly experimental poets. Okay, people who wrote that kind of experimental poetry. The first generation comprised John Ashbery, Barbara Guest, James Schuller, Kenneth Koch, and Frank O'Hara. And the second generation, Alice Notley, Ted Berrigan, Bill Bergson, and Rob Paget. So when it was a heyday of the first generation, they had this magazine called Locus Solus, which published their poems. Now, what are some of the features of the New York School? And as I said, it is highly experimental, like the New York School of Painting. It borrowed elements from philosophy, and it was anti-establishment and anti-academic. Okay, so it rejected all existing norms. It rejected existing hierarchies. It rejected existing institutions and tried to pave its own way in poetry. Okay, so New York painters belonging to the New York School, such as Jackson Pollock, William Cooning, Motherwell, all these people influenced the New York School of Poetry. All right. Now, they were, as I said before, they were influenced by abstract expressionism and action painting. Action painting is where colors are just thrown onto the canvas. Okay, there is no order, there's no system. So all these also influenced the New York School of Poetry. A very significant feature of the school was that they focused on everyday life and everyday objects. They did not try to think about something out of the ordinary. They talked about ordinary things. Anything could be a subject matter for poetry. Even a comb could be a subject matter for poetry. Even a pen could be a subject matter for poetry. Okay, so they wrote about everyday objects and everyday life in a very conversational tone, in a very casual tone. They, like the confessional poets, they did not adopt any high grandiose language. They used the language of the common person, and they talked as if it were a conversation, as if talking to a friend. Okay, it was not formal. The language was highly informal. And these kind of poetry had this feature which they blurred the boundaries between art and life. Okay, so after reading a poem, we would get confused as to what is real and what is unreal. Okay, so the boundaries were very blurred since it was a highly experimental kind of poetry. Now, the New York School used surrealist motifs, okay, abstract motifs and symbols, and poetry was considered a process, not a product. The writing of poetry was given importance. The language was given importance. The way in which syllables, sounds, structures, lines, all these were ordered gained prominence. And they said that when you read a poem, you should focus on the methods of writing it. A poem showcases its own methods, how it was written, under what context, how were the sentences ordered. So you should focus on the language and you should focus on the poem as a process, according to the New York School. And they also, like I said, anything can be poetry material, even pop art, even graffiti. You can also write poems for graffiti. Okay, and experiences were taken from everyday life and presented not in a normal manner but in a surrealist manner. Okay, in a very surreal way that it looked very dreamy kind of. And this movement comprised people from different walks of life. Okay, there were people who were homosexuals like Ashbery, Schuler, and O'Hara. So these people, they found in this school an area where they could express themselves. So things like the confessional poetry, these were all dominated by heterosexual people. Okay, so they were a privileged group. But this one, in the New York school, it accepted heterogeneity. There were people who were homosexuals, there were people who were heterosexuals, there were people who were from different walks of life. Now, existentialism, which we discussed earlier, and transcendentalism, which is a movement in philosophy, which is a movement in American literature, American transcendentalism, where they write about nature and about transcendental experiences. All these influenced the New York school. Now, so did imagism, romanticism, surrealism, French symbolism. You can see the influences of all this in the images that they use, in the themes that they adopt. Okay. Now, in painting, the style is very important. You see the painting and you try to understand whether it is written in the surreal, being painted in the surreal style, or French impressionist style or expressionist style. So like that, in art also, in poetry also, the medium, the style of using language, medium is language. The language assumed prominence. There were a number of images and experiences that were felt through the senses, the eyes, the ears, the skin. That kind of experiences were articulated by the New York School of Poetry. Okay, and there's a tonal complexity. The tone keeps on changing, and there is a very marked rhythm to the poems belonging to the New York school. So, as mentioned before, Frank O'Hara was a major poet belonging to this school, and he wrote about things like pop art, television calls, social life in Manhattan, where he resided, and his writings were mostly personal. Okay, his writings were mostly personal and centered on the everyday. He did not take elements from outside. He did not discuss grandiose themes. He took personal elements and everyday moments. All right, and his writing had a certain kind of polish and urbanity, a kind of style to them, and sometimes they were very celebratory and funny. Okay, so opposed to the confessional poets, the writings of the New York school were mostly kind of vibrant, and happy. And you can see techniques used in painting like Dadaist techniques or Surrealist techniques or French symbolist techniques in the poetry of this period. Now, Frank O'Hara wrote a poem titled A Step Away from Them. And he writes, "It's my lunch hour, so I go for a walk among the hum-colored caps." Very simple poem, right? It's lunchtime, and he takes a walk, and there are cars all around. This is a common scene in Manhattan. This is a common scene in Mumbai, for instance, in any major city. Okay, this is an everyday moment when a man comes out of the office and goes for lunch and moves amongst the cars. So this becomes poetry. An everyday moment becomes a moment of significant, sublime poetry for Frank O'Hara. His other works include The Day Lady Died, Joe's Jacket, Platinum, Watching TV, etc. Platinum, Watching TV, etc. Okay. Now, John Ashbery, Kenneth Koch, okay, all these people belong to this school, and critics say that the New York school shows the fullness of life, as opposed to the confessional poets. They celebrate life. They talk about the possibilities of life, and they experiment with language, and they experiment with techniques, okay, to depict the happiness inherent in human life. Other writers include Anne Waldman, Ron Padgett, Joe Brainerd, James Schuler, and all of them wrote a number of poems.